The record begins with a sound. Not an explosion, not a weapon discharge, not the grinding collapse of a hull under pressure. Just a sound, small, almost domestic, the soft mechanical asterisk click asterisk of a stylus being set down on a data slate by a Velthari archivist named Sovendray, in a room so quiet that the ventilation system's hum felt intrusive. He had been reviewing the asset manifest for the 6th time that morning. 41 vessels, human designation, warships, Velthari designation, seized, every transponder confirmed, every hull accounted for, every weapon system locked, catalogued, and cold. He set the stylus down because his hand had started to shake. Not from fear, from a number. The manifest listed 41 ships. The Human Naval Registry, cross-referenced through 3 independent intelligence sources, listed 41 ships total. Sovendray had seized everything humanity had. So why, at 3:40 station time, had long-range passive sensors detected what appeared to be drive signatures? Deep, quiet, moving without transponders, moving without sound, moving in a formation that the tactical computer could not identify because it had never been programmed to look for anything that small moving that slowly in that direction. He picked the stylus back up, set it down again. The question he wrote in his personal log, the one that would later be recovered, translated, and distributed to every intelligence agency in the conclave, was not strategic. It was not tactical. It was 4 words. What did they hide? The seizure had taken 11 minutes. That detail would become the most discussed fact in Velthari military history, not the diplomatic aftermath, not the asset value, not the political consequences of taking humanity's entire armed fleet in a single coordinated action. The 11 minutes, because 11 minutes implied something that every Velthari analyst had chosen, perhaps deliberately, not to examine too carefully. It implied humanity had not resisted. Commodore Velinathari had commanded the seizure operation from the bridge of the asterisk relentless theorem asterisk, the Velthari flagship that the humans would later, privately, call by a different name, one that translated roughly as asterisk the ship that thought it had already won. Velinathari was a methodical officer, 30 years of service, 17 engagements. Zero tolerance for the kind of romantic sentimentality that occasionally infected younger commanders when dealing with younger species. Humans were a young species, 40 years of spaceflight, a single inhabited world, a navy assembled from commercial hulls and retrofitted mining vessels, and in 2 notable cases, ships that appeared to have been constructed using design philosophies borrowed from large ocean-going vessels that no longer existed on a planet they no longer primarily occupied. Their technology was functional. Their coordination was unremarkable. Their threat assessment score, according to the Conclave's standardized evaluation matrix, was a 4 out of a possible 12. A 4. Velinathari had commanded operations against species rated 7, 8, and once a brutal, grinding campaign against a species rated 10. She understood threat. She understood resistance. She understood the particular texture of a species that knew it was going to lose and fought any way out of something she had no word for in her language, though human linguists would later suggest the closest translation was asterisk spite. The humans had not fought. They had complied, immediately, precisely, with a kind of surgical cooperation that she had found at the time professionally satisfying. All vessels have cut engines, her tactical officer had reported. No weapons hot, no distress signals, no encrypted traffic. Boarding teams. Welcomed aboard. Human crews are standing in formation in their respective cargo bays. Velinathari had paused at that. Formation. Yes, Commodore, standing in rows, unarmed, silent. She had looked at her second-in-command, a younger officer named Tethoran who had a habit of anthropomorphizing alien behavior that she found professionally irritating and occasionally, privately, useful. What does that mean? She'd asked him, in human terms. Tethorin had considered it. I'm not certain. It could be a surrender posture, or it could be ceremonial. Humans have a number of behaviors that look identical from the outside but mean opposite things depending on context. Which context applies here? He had hesitated. That's the part I'm not certain about. She had moved on. 11 minutes. Complete success. She had filed her report and used the word compliant 4 times in the opening paragraph. She would later cross out every instance of that word, because compliant implied the humans had been given a choice. And that was the first misinterpretation. The human who had organized the surrender was not a military officer. His name was Dara Osai, and his official title was Deputy Coordinator of Interstellar Logistics for the Terran Cooperative Fleet Authority, a position so aggressively bureaucratic in its naming that most Velthari intelligence analysts who encountered it in translated documents assumed it was a clerical role, a paper pusher, a man who counted things and filed reports. He was 43 years old. He had a daughter whose name was Imani, who was 11, who collected pressed flowers in a book she kept under her bed because she was afraid they would get damaged if she left them on her shelf. He kept a photograph of her on his personal data device, not a holograph, not a digital image, but an actual printed photograph, physical, faded slightly at one corner, and he had looked at it for approximately 4 seconds before walking into the communications suite on the Asterisk Meridian crossing and accepting the Velthari boarding team's arrival. He had been shaking, not visibly. He had learned years ago to shake on the inside. The Velthari boarding officer was a young functionary named Resvone who had been selected for the assignment specifically because he had cross-cultural diplomacy training and was considered unlikely to escalate unnecessarily. He arrived on the Asterisk Meridian crossing with 6 security personnel and a translation device, and a posture that communicated, with remarkable precision across species lines, the particular combination of authority and discomfort that comes from being asked to do something distasteful by someone more powerful than you. You are the ranking authority aboard this vessel, Resvone asked. Dara looked at him for a moment. I'm the one you need to talk to, he said. Resvone logged this as a confirmation. The Velthari Conclave has formally requisitioned all vessels under Terran military registration. Your cooperation is noted and will be reflected in the diplomatic record. You and your crew will be transported to the processing facility at. I know where we're going, Dara said. Another pause. Resvone's translation device flagged the interruption as potentially aggressive, then revised its assessment to culturally assertive, then gave up and marked the interaction context unclear. You have questions? Resvone asked. Dara looked at him for another long moment. His expression was one that Resvone would spend considerable time analyzing in the months afterward, a look that he could only describe, inadequately, as asterisk someone who knows more about where they are standing than you do about where they are standing. No, Dara said, no questions. He turned and walked back toward the cargo bay, where his crew was standing in formation. In rows, silent, waiting. Resvone watched him go and felt, for reasons he could not immediately articulate and would not be able to explain for quite some time, that he had just failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The processing facility was located on Velthari Station Kethmora, a structure that had been in continuous operation for 230 years, and had, in that time, processed the crews of 19 different seized or surrendered vessels belonging to 11 different species. Its administrators were efficient. Its records were meticulous. Its staff had seen enough alien physiologies to have long since stopped being surprised by biological variation. They were not prepared for the humans. Not because the humans were physically unusual. They weren't. Bipedal, bilateral symmetry, unremarkable. The Velthari medical team had flagged one thing in the initial health assessment, a baseline cortisol level that the instruments kept misreading as a calibration error, because the levels were so far above what the Velthari medical database listed as a biological distress threshold that the system assumed the instruments were broken. Every single human tested the same way. Every single one. These readings indicate they should be in acute psychological collapse, the medical officer told the facility administrator, a woman named Coordinator Pethsilon, who had managed this station for 19 years and had, in that time, developed a very precise and finely calibrated tolerance for surprises. Elevated cortisol at these levels in any species we have on record corresponds to extreme fear response or severe physiological trauma. Coordinator Pethsilon looked at the readouts, looked at the humans through the observation window. The humans were sitting, standing, talking quietly to each other, passing around small containers of what the chemical analysis identified as a caffeinated beverage. "They don't look traumatized," she said. "No," the medical officer agreed, "they don't. So either the instruments are wrong. I've run 3 calibration cycles. The instruments are correct. Or," Pethsilon said slowly, "this is their baseline." The medical officer didn't answer for a moment. Then, "If this is their baseline, coordinator, then they walk around every day of their lives at what our models classify as a stress response, equivalent to being in immediate mortal danger." Pethsilon looked at the humans again. One of them laughed at something, a real laugh, unguarded, spontaneous. "And yet," she said. "And yet," the medical officer confirmed. She filed a report. It was marked physiological anomaly, low priority, pending further study. It sat in a queue for 3 weeks. By the time anyone senior enough to understand its implications read it, the situation had changed considerably. Dara Os had been in the processing facility for 9 days when the first thing happened that the Velthari security system failed to flag. He asked for a piece of paper. Not a data slate, not a terminal access request. Paper. Physical. He explained through the translation interface that he had a mild photosensitivity that made prolonged screen use uncomfortable, and that he preferred to write by hand when possible, and that this was a documented medical accommodation that the Terran Cooperative Fleet Authority provided as a standard provision to all employees. The documentation was real. His medical file confirmed it. Pethsilon approved the request without much deliberation. Paper was not a security risk, and the administrative friction of denying a documented medical accommodation was greater than the administrative friction of approving it. He received a notebook, physical, standard issue, 48 pages. He filled it in 6 days. Then he asked for another. This was also approved. What no one thought to do, because why would you, was to compare the number of words a single human could write by hand per day against the number of pages he was filling. When that comparison was eventually made, the math did not resolve correctly. He was filling pages faster than a human hand should be capable of filling pages, unless the writing was very small, or the information density was extremely high, or both. By then, the notebooks were already gone. He had asked twice to speak with other detained crew members for what he described as morale maintenance purposes, a phrase that the translation system rendered literally and that the security staff had understood as something like a welfare check. Each visit had been supervised. Each visit had appeared on the observation records to be exactly what he said it was: people talking, people maintaining morale. The Velthari didn't have a word for dead drop. They had one now. 22 days after the seizure, Sovendre finally escalated his sensor anomaly report to the level where it reached Commodore Velanathari's desk. She read it twice. "Drive signatures," she said. "Passive only," Sovendre confirmed. He had traveled from his station specifically for this meeting. He was still holding the data slate with the original readings, as if he needed the physical object to make the numbers feel real. No active emissions, no transponder pings, moving at approximately 3% of standard cruise velocity. 3%, Velanathari said. That's almost undetectable, yes. At that speed in that configuration, our active scan systems wouldn't register them as significant. The passive array caught them only because of a calibration update we installed 12 days ago. Without that update, we would never have seen them. How many signatures? Sovindre hesitated, and in that hesitation lived something that Velanathari would later describe as the moment she first felt something that her language also did not have a precise word for, but that human linguists might render as asterisk the specific fear that comes from realizing that the ground you thought was solid has been hollow all along. The count varies, he said. Varies how? The signatures are not constant. They appear. They disappear. They reappear in different positions. Some are almost certainly the same signature moving. The movement patterns are consistent with that interpretation. But some are not. Some appear in locations where no vessel moving at 3% velocity could have traveled from the last known position in the elapsed time. Velanathari set down the data slate. You're saying there may be more than we're detecting. I'm saying the number I can confirm is 117 distinct signatures. I'm saying the number that the pattern analysis suggests could actually be present is, he stopped, significantly higher. She looked at him for a long moment. We seized 41 ships, she said. Yes. The Human Naval Registry lists 41 ships. Yes. Sovindre, where did they come from? He looked at the data slate, at the numbers, at the formations that the tactical computer couldn't identify because it had never been programmed to look for anything that moved like that quietly in that direction. I don't know, he said. That's what frightens me. The answer, partial, incomplete, and in retrospect far more alarming than the question, was discovered not through intelligence work but through an accident. A junior communications technician on Kethmora Station, named Velpraz, was running a routine frequency sweep when she encountered a transmission she couldn't immediately categorize. It was not on any registered human communication band. It was not encrypted in any format the Velthari systems recognized. It was, in fact, so ordinary in its structure that it had been automatically logged and ignored by the station's AI screening system, which had identified it as background noise from a commercial relay. Velpraz was 26 years old and had been in her position for 8 months, and had exactly the kind of bored, meticulous attention to detail that produces either brilliant analysts or profound administrative headaches, and she had not yet determined which one she was. She pulled the transmission out of the noise log because the frequency pattern struck her as having a rhythm that didn't match natural interference. She ran it through the linguistic analysis suite and got nothing. She ran it through the signal analysis suite and got something. Not a message, a timing sequence, a heartbeat, regular, consistent, built into the carrier wave at a level so subtle that you had to know what you were looking for before you could find it. She almost missed what made it significant. The timing wasn't binary, wasn't base 12 like Velthari mathematical notation, wasn't any base she could immediately identify. It was based in human mathematics, human rhythm, human signal, hidden inside what appeared to be nothing, transmitted on a frequency the Velthari had never thought to monitor because it corresponded to a wavelength that was, according to everything they knew about spaceflight physics, essentially useless for long-range communication. Unless, Velpraz said to herself, in an empty room at 2:17 station time, you don't need it to travel far, unless you just need it to travel to something that's very close and very quiet. She pulled up the passive sensor logs. She overlaid the transmission timestamps against Sovindre's drive signature detections. Every transmission corresponded to a signature movement. Every single one. The humans in the processing facility were talking to the ships, through paper, through notebooks filled with what appeared to be personal writing and were actually something else entirely, through visits to other detained crew members that appeared to be welfare checks and were actually coordination sessions, through a communication channel built on a frequency that the Velthari had never monitored because there had never been a reason to monitor it. Velpraz sat in the silence of her empty monitoring room and experienced what she would later describe. In the debrief that lasted 11 hours and was classified at the highest level, as the specific sensation of realizing that every assumption you have made about a situation is not merely wrong, but is the exact wrong that someone else designed for you to make. She filed her report. Pethsilon read it at 400. By 4:15, every notebook in the processing facility had been confiscated. By 4:20, Dara Osei was in an isolation cell. By 4:30, the drive signatures on the passive sensors had stopped moving. Not disappeared, stopped. Waiting. You knew we would find the signal eventually, Pethsilon said. Dara was sitting across from her in the interrogation suite. He looked tired, genuinely, physically tired, in a way that he hadn't looked for the first 3 weeks of his detention. He had a cup of the caffeinated beverage she'd authorized for him, and he was holding it in both hands, not drinking it, just holding it, and she had the impression that the warmth of it was what he needed rather than the contents. I calculated a 93% probability you'd find it before we were ready, he said. Pethsilon processed that sentence very carefully. Before you were *ready. Yes. Ready for what? He looked at his cup. I'm not going to tell you that. You understand I can compel. You can compel my body, Dara said quietly. That's not the part that's useful to you. The silence stretched out. Somewhere in the corridor outside, Pethsilon could hear the distant sound of footsteps, her staff, reconfiguring security protocols, pulling records, beginning the escalation process that would eventually reach Velanathari and then the conclave itself. A machinery of response, grinding into motion. The ships outside, she said, the ones we can't fully count, those aren't in your naval registry. No, they're not military vessels. Dara looked at her then. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite something else. She couldn't name it. Her training hadn't given her language for it. That depends, he said carefully, on how you define military. Velanathari received the full briefing at 600 and spent the next 4 hours doing something that her staff had rarely seen her do, sitting still. She sat in her command chair on the bridge of the Relentless Theorem and stared at the main display screen, which was showing the updated passive sensor analysis that Sovendre's team had spent the night refining. The numbers were still uncertain. The formations were still unclassified, but the scale had become clearer, and the scale was the problem that she could not stop sitting with. The human-registered naval fleet was 41 vessels, she said, to no one in particular. Her crew was very quiet. What are we looking at now? Her tactical officer, a careful woman named Brethsal who had worked with Velanathari for 6 years and understood the specific register of her commander's voice that meant answer precisely and do not soften anything, pulled up the consolidated analysis. Best estimate, based on current signature counts adjusted for detection probability and cross-referencing movement patterns, 340 to 500 vessels, possibly more. Possibly more, Velanathari repeated. The passive array has improving resolution but still has significant blind spots. We're triangulating from multiple stations, but the vessels are moving in ways that seem specifically designed to exploit those blind spots. The patterns are Commodore. The patterns look intentional. Of course they're intentional. She was quiet again for a moment. What kind of vessels, tonnage, configuration? That's where it becomes, Brethsal hesitated. Irregular. The drive signatures are all over the map. We're seeing what appear to be very large vessels moving alongside very small ones. Some signatures suggest configurations we'd associate with cargo haulers. Some match profiles we'd associate with mining operations. Some we can't classify at all. Velanathari finally moved. She stood up and walked to the main display and stood in front of it with her hands clasped behind her back and stared at the scattered points of light that represented ships she couldn't name, built by a species she had underestimated by a number she was still trying to calculate. They gave us their navy, she said slowly. They gave us every registered military vessel they owned, without resistance, in 11 minutes. She paused, because those weren't the ships they were planning to use. No one on the bridge spoke. Tethoran, she said, her anthropologist, her irritating, useful, occasionally brilliant second-in-command. Commodore, tell me what I'm missing. Tell me what humans do that I don't have a framework for. Tethoran was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in a way that Velanathari recognized as the voice of someone saying something they have been thinking for a long time and are only now judging to be survivable to say aloud. Humans, he said, have been building things for as long as they have existed, not just military things, everything. Boats that crossed oceans before they understood what was on the other side, structures that outlasted the civilizations that built them. They built tools and then built better tools and then built tools to build better tools. It's compulsive almost, structural. They don't build for the war that exists. They build for the war they believe is eventually coming. How long have they known about the conclave? First contact was 41 years ago. And they've had spaceflight for 40 years. They had spaceflight before first contact, Tethoran said carefully. The conclave made first contact when humanity had been operating in space for approximately 14 months. What we don't know, what we have never been adequately resourced to determine, is what they have been building in the 40 years since. Not officially, not on registered manifests, in the places we didn't think to look, in the frequencies we never monitored, in the configurations we don't have categories for. Velanathari turned from the display. Go to the processing facility, she said. Talk to the man, the one they call Osai. What do you want me to ask him? I want to know what they built. He won't tell me. I know, she said. Watch how he doesn't tell you. The shape of what he refuses to say will tell me more than the answer would. Tethoran sat across from Dara Osai in the interrogation suite and set a cup of the caffeinated beverage between them like an offering. Dara looked at it, looked at Tethoran. Something shifted, not trust exactly, but recognition. One person identifying another person who is trying. You're not security, Dara said. No. What are you? Someone who is trying to understand. Dara picked up the cup, actually drank from it this time. That's a rarer thing than it should be. Among your people or mine. A pause. Then something crossed Dara's face that Tethoran would spend considerable time analyzing. Amusement, but underneath it grief. The specific combination of the two that belongs to someone who is carrying something enormous and has been carrying it long enough that it has become part of their body. We didn't build warships, Dara said suddenly. Tethoran kept his expression neutral. What did you build? We built ships, he set the cup down. Everything humanity builds has more than one use. That's not strategy, that's not cleverness, it's just how we think. A cargo hauler can carry cargo, it can also carry people, it can also be modified, it can also be loaded with things that are not technically cargo but are not technically weapons either, depending on the circumstances. He paused. We've been building ships for 40 years, all kinds of ships. We registered the ones we were required to register. We didn't register the ones we weren't required to register. Because they weren't military vessels. They were not, when they were built, military vessels. Tethoran sat very still, and now. Dara was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, His voice was so even and so controlled that Tethorin felt something move along his spine that was older and more primal than anything his training had prepared him for. "I want you to ask yourself something," Dara said. "You took our fleet. You did it in 11 minutes. You were very efficient, very professional." He looked at his hands. "Did you ask yourself why we let you?" "We assumed." "I know what you assumed." His voice was still even. "Did you ask yourself whether we wanted you to have those ships?" The silence was total. "If the only vessels in your sensor range were our registered fleet," Dara continued, "then our registered fleet was the only thing you had reason to watch. And if you were watching our registered fleet," he stopped. "You weren't watching anything else," Tethorin said. "We've been moving for 22 days, Dara said simply. "You detected us 9 days ago. We've been moving for 22 days. The things you could see were the things we built to be seen." Tethorin stood up very suddenly. His chair scraped back. He looked at Dara Osai, at this tired man holding a warm cup in a detention cell on a station that was now surrounded by something neither of them could fully count, and asked the question that had been hovering at the edge of the conversation since it began. "What are they waiting for?" Dara looked up at him. His eyes were calm. The shaking, the inside shaking that Tethorin had no way of seeing, had stopped. Not because the fear was gone, because the carrying was almost done. "For me to stop being useful as a communication channel," he said, "and for you to be looking in the right direction when I do." Velinathari was still on the bridge when Tethorin's report arrived. She read it standing, read it again, then did something she had not done in 6 years of command. She asked to speak to the person being detained directly herself, without an intermediary. Dara Osa was brought to a secure communication suite instead of the interrogation room. The difference was small, but she had chosen it deliberately. It meant something in human social geometry, she had been told. She was working with every framework she had. She sat across from him, and for a moment said nothing. He said nothing either. "I need you to tell me what the trigger is," she finally said. "I am not asking you to tell me the plan. I am not asking you to tell me the disposition of the vessels. I am asking you to tell me what happens, what action on my part, or inaction on my part, causes whatever comes next to begin." Dara looked at her with that expression she was beginning to understand was not concealment but precision. A person measuring exactly how much information would serve their purpose. "Are you asking so you can prevent it?" he said. "I'm asking so I understand what I'm choosing between." Something changed in his face then, a very small thing, but she was watching for it. "Negotiation," he said quietly. "Genuine negotiation, not conclave legal process, not the diplomatic framework that requires us to operate as a client species under Article 17 of the Compact. A conversation between equals, formal, documented, binding, with humanity treated as a full participant, not a subject. The conclave has never." "I know what the conclave has never done," Dara said. "I also know what the conclave has never faced." He glanced at the display screen on the wall of the suite, which showed, because it had been left on, the updated passive sensor analysis. He looked at it for a moment. "We're not asking to win a war, Commodore. We're asking you to notice that one has already started. What happens next depends on whether you'd prefer that we finish it or talk about it." She was quiet for a long moment. "Those ships out there," she said. "Some of them will be armed. Most of them probably aren't standard military construction. But they're there, and they've been moving for 22 days, and we didn't see them coming, and I am now sitting here trying to calculate what it costs me to call them a fleet versus what it costs me to call them something I don't have a word for yet." "We call them the reserve," Dara said. "What does that mean?" "It means there are more where those came from." The silence that followed was not the silence of a standoff. It was the silence of a threshold. Both of them standing at it, both of them aware of what was on the other side, both of them understanding, with remarkable precision, that the next person to speak was going to change something that could not be unchanged. Velanathari spoke. "I will contact the conclave," she said. "I will not tell them I am recommending negotiation. I will tell them that the tactical situation requires reassessment." She paused. "That will take 48 hours. Dara nodded slowly. "The fleet will stay where it is for 48 hours. After that, Dara said, "whatever hasn't been started will have to be finished." The 48 hours were the longest Tethoran had ever experienced. He spent most of them reviewing everything the Velthari intelligence apparatus had ever filed regarding humanity. 40 years of reports, assessments, cultural analyses, economic models, threat evaluations. He read them with the specific attention of someone who now knows the conclusion and is working backward to find where every step went wrong. The answer was everywhere. The reports were not inaccurate. They described with reasonable precision everything the Velthari had been able to observe. The infrastructure, the biology, the psychology, the social structures, the political organization, the technological development. They described it all correctly. What they had failed to do, consistently, thoroughly, across 40 years and hundreds of analysts, was to understand what the observed facts implied. The human cortisol finding should have told them something. A species that operates at maximum stress response as a biological baseline is not a species that experiences danger the same way other species do. It is a species that has been living in a state of maximum physiological readiness for its entire evolutionary history and has built, not despite that, but because of it, an entire civilization on the premise that the danger is always there, always real, always approaching, and the only rational response is to keep building. The 41 registered ships should have told them something. 40 years of spaceflight, and humanity had registered 41 military vessels. A species that built boats before it understood what oceans were. A species that had, in the 200 years before spaceflight, produced more individual watercraft than the Velthari had produced in their entire maritime history. The surrender in 11 minutes should have told them something. 11 minutes to surrender everything you've registered, everything you've declared, everything you've allowed the other side to know about is not a defeat. It is a redeployment of attention. They had been given the answer 40 years ago and had written it down and filed it and never read it in the right order. He found the original first contact cultural assessment, filed by the initial diplomatic team, translated from a human sociological text that had been included in the initial information exchange as a demonstration of human academic openness. He found the passage that had been highlighted by the original analyst and marked asterisk interesting, low strategic relevance. It said, historically, the most significant human military developments have never occurred in the categories that contemporary observers identified as the primary military domains. The cavalry was decisive when everyone was focused on infantry. The submarine was decisive when everyone was focused on surface fleets. The decisive advantage is almost never where the decisive battle appears to be. Low strategic relevance. Tethoran closed the file. He went to find Velanathari. She was in her private office, and she had been on the communication line with the conclave for 6 hours, and the sounds of those conversations, the ones he could hear through the door, muffled, strained, interrupted, told him everything he needed to know about how those conversations were going. She emerged at hour 37, and she looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had not yet decided whether she was going to set it down. "They said no," Tethoran said, "not a question. They said the situation does not meet the threshold for treaty modification." "What threshold?" She looked at him with an expression he had seen before, in the faces of people who have been asked to enforce a policy they no longer believe in. "Existential threat," she said. The Conclave's legal framework for renegotiating species status requires a demonstrated existential threat. How do they define? Active hostilities, confirmed casualties, documented military engagement. She stopped. They're waiting for us to be shot at. Tethoran processed that. We've been surrounded for 22 days by a fleet we can't count that we didn't know existed, operated by a species we've had in detention for a month. And no one has fired at anyone, Velanathari said, which is apparently the problem. The 48 hours ended at 600 station time. Tethoran was on the bridge. Velanathari was on the bridge. The entire senior staff was on the bridge. The passive sensors were running at maximum resolution across all available arrays. And the picture they produced was the clearest it had been since detection began. 381 confirmed signatures. Formation analysis still incomplete. Configuration analysis still incomplete. Weapons status unknown because the vessels were not emitting any active scan or targeting signals. They were just there, present, quiet. The galaxy's largest question mark, made of steel and human stubbornness, arranged in a pattern that the tactical AI kept trying to classify as a siege formation and kept having to revise, because it wasn't quite that, and it wasn't quite anything else the database knew either. At 6:01, Dara Osai's voice came over the communication channel. He was still in the secure suite. He sounded, to Velanathari's ear, like a man who has been awake for 37 hours and has stopped being afraid not because the danger has passed, but because the fear has been fully absorbed into the purpose, and there is no longer a distinction between them. "Commodore," he said. "Mr. Osai." The conclave declined. "Yes." A pause. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" She thought about the 11 minutes, about the formation in the cargo bay, about the photograph he'd been carrying, about the medical readings that shouldn't have been anyone's baseline but were, about 40 years of ships built by a species that didn't build for the war that existed, but for the war it believed was eventually coming. "No," she said honestly, "I don't think I am." A longer pause. "I'd like to speak to the conclave directly," Dara said, "not as a detained individual, as the authorized representative of the Terran Cooperative. I have credentials. The legal framework exists. They are required, under their own compact, to accept a formal address from a legally credentialed representative of any recognized species." Velanathari looked at Tethoran. Tethoran was looking at his display. He looked up, nodded once. She opened the channel. What Dara Osai said to the conclave lasted 14 minutes. He did not threaten. He did not demand. He did not describe the fleet outside in terms of its size or its armament or its capabilities. He described his daughter. He described the photograph he carried, the pressed flowers under the bed. He described what it meant to have brought humanity this far. 40 years of spaceflight, 40 years of building, 40 years of absorbing the specific knowledge that the galaxy had powerful neighbors who viewed younger species as problems to be managed. And to have made the calculation, the calm and terrible and fully considered calculation, that the only way to make sure Imani's children lived in a galaxy where they were free was to make that case, here, now. In the only language that had ever actually worked. "We did not come here to fight you," he said. "We built the capability to fight you so that we would never have to. There is a distinction, and I am asking you to understand it, because the alternative is a conversation neither of us can win." He paused. "The ships outside your station are not here to attack. They are here to exist, to be visible, to be counted, to make the point that we made once, quietly, 40 years ago when you arrived at our planet and we showed you everything we had and you looked at it and saw a 4. Another pause. "We are asking to be seen correctly. That is all. We are asking for the conversation that should have happened 40 years ago." He stopped. I have a photograph of my daughter. She is 11. She collects flowers. I would like to be alive to see what she collects when she is 20, and I would like the galaxy she grows up in to be one that made the right decision when it had the opportunity." The conclave was silent for a very long time. Velanathari sat in her command chair afterward and watched the passive sensors. The 381 signatures were still there, still present, still quiet. "What are they waiting for now?" Breathsal asked. "The same thing we are," Velanathari said. The conclave deliberated for 11 hours. 11 hours, the same number of minutes it had taken to seize a fleet that had turned out to be bait, a decoy, a deliberate misdirection designed by a species that had been planning for this moment, since the first time a Velthari diplomat had looked at everything humanity had built and assigned it a number. A 4. The response came at 1740. Velanathari read it, and then she read it again, and then she sat with it for a moment in the specific silence of someone absorbing a shift in the floor they have been standing on their entire life. She opened the communication channel. "Mr. Osai. Commodore. The conclave has agreed to convene a formal status review under Article 42 of the Compact. It will be a full session. Legal representatives, diplomatic staff, the entire framework." She paused. This has not happened before, for any species. A silence on the other end of the channel. Then, when? 90 days. Another silence, longer. "The fleet will maintain its current position for 90 days, he said. "It will not advance. It will not retreat. It will be exactly as visible as it is now." Another pause. "And Commodore." "Yes. There are more where these came from. I want you to know that not as a threat. I want you to know it so that the conclave makes this decision understanding what they're actually deciding." His voice was even, tired, certain. "We are not asking for mercy. We are asking to be correctly counted." She closed the channel. Tathoran was standing beside her command chair. He had been there for most of the conversation. She didn't look at him. "Correctly counted," she said. "What do you think they number? Actually, all of them." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think we have the capability to determine that." "Make an estimate." The registered fleet was 41 vessels. What we can currently detect is roughly 10 times that. But if the detection is as incomplete as the pattern analysis suggests, and if they've been building since first contact using a model that prioritizes concealment over registration, he stopped. "I think the question of how many ships humans have is less important than the question of how many humans are on those ships, and behind those ships, and on the planet those ships came from." Velanathari looked at the sensor display, at the 381 lights that represented ships that had been moving for 22 days without being seen. 8 billion, she said quietly. "That's the population figure." "Yes. Every one of them running at a cortisol level that our medical systems classify as acute distress. Every single day. And they look like that." She gestured vaguely at nothing, at the remembered image of the humans in the cargo bay standing in formation, or sitting in the processing facility drinking their caffeinated beverage, or laughing, genuinely laughing, in a detention room on a station they had strategically surrounded without firing a single shot. "We measured them and got a 4, she said. "And the thing I cannot stop thinking about, the thing that I will not be able to stop thinking about, is that the scale we used only goes to 12. Tathoran said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The lights on the sensor display held their positions. 381 quiet points in the dark, neither advancing nor retreating, waiting with the specific patience of a species that has spent its entire existence waiting for the moment when the thing it was building would finally be visible enough to matter. Somewhere in the processing facility, Dara Os held a photograph of a girl who collected flowers, and the warmth coming through the printed paper was not from the image, but from the years it represented, and the years it might yet contain, if the next 90 days went correctly. Somewhere in the dark outside the station, 381 ships waited alongside, however, many more the sensors couldn't find. Cargo haulers and mining vessels, and modified hulls built without registration numbers. Crewed by people who had signed no military oath and carried no military rank, and had simply answered the question that 40 years of being assigned a number had posed. Are you coming? Yes. And beyond those ships, 86 light-years away, a planet turned in its orbit and 8 billion people with elevated cortisol and an evolutionary history built on the premise that the danger was always real and always approaching, continued to build things for a war that, if the next 90 days went correctly, they would never have to fight. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest, not the most advanced, not the most diplomatically sophisticated, or the most biologically remarkable, or the most technologically extraordinary. They were the species that had seen the galaxy clearly on the very first day and had quietly begun counting.